Why then do we still have Concert FM?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because there was some controversy, as you recall.
I heard about it.
Julian, and whereby we at RNZ said we're not delivering effectively on our charter. But to cut a long story short, this was about a movement away from a traditional audience to attracting a new audience, primarily a young brown audience. All of a sudden we found ourselves with a huge backlash. Where it became concerning for me was when I had predominantly Pākehā New Zealanders telling me that this was cultural vandalism, and there was no real reference points for, apart from the fact that something that many of them saw as being a crucial part of their cultural outlook on life was now being challenged. And so, welcome to our world. This is what Māori see all the time.
Today's episode is a story of leadership. As an academic, a senior executive, a CEO, and now a respected chair of many governance entities, Dr. Jim Mather is a man with a unique perspective on how iwi entities, government agencies, and charitable organisations can and should help Māori and Pasifika communities across Aotearoa. It's Dr. Jim Mather on Indigenous 100. E te hoa e Jim, tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe te hoa pūmau.
No mai ki tēnei kaupapa, e kia nei Indigenous 100. It's awesome to have you here.
Tēnā koe hoa.
Jim, in 2014, in your doctoral thesis, you submit a framework for Māori development, iwi development, with specific reference to Ngāti Awa, but I think for many iwi. And that framework, you give it the name Kia uru kahikatea te tū. Fast forward 6 years, you're now the chair of RNZ. But I want to talk a little bit about iwi development, iwi leadership, and we'll go into other areas as well. You were a long-time executive, you were a chief executive, and at the time I think you presented your doctorate thesis, you were CEO of Wānanga o Aotearoa. What has made you, what is the secret for your success? Why have you been a successful executive? Why were you able to write a thesis that, for my reading anyway, made a lot of sense? What makes you tick?
Kia ora, Julian. I'm a kid that grew up in really humble places. I was very fortunate when I was young to spend 3 or 4 years living with my nanny and koro in Te Teko, a humble Māori community, a Māori speaking community, a community that has changed over the years, and from there I lived also in Otara and Māori. So I think the nurturing I've received from those communities has always stayed with me in terms of whilst they were poor communities, whilst they were very humble communities, they were very supportive communities. There wasn't a high expectation placed on many of us from those communities, and I can remember going through my schooling and all of my time at Māori College. There were only 2 luminaries that we could reflect upon in terms of successful graduates of that institution, and one was the great Frank Bunce, the All Black Centre, and the other one was Willie Jackson, and who you and I both know very, very well, and I've talked to Willie about this over the years. There was no expectation placed upon us. We were expected to try and get through our secondary education and make the most of it, and so university was never an option for us. Polytechnics and institutes of technologies and so forth. So yeah, really the options that we saw as being viable were to go to the freezing works at Tūhoe. That was a prime career pathway back in the mid to late 80s, and earlier than that, obviously. Railway yards was another good option as well. The Ministry of Works back in those days, and for those like me who drew the short straw, you end up in the military. So to answer your question, I think that short straw of finding myself in the military at 18 ended up being probably a life-changing event. Talking about the very early 80s here. I arrived in Wauru at 18 years of age. There were a lot of Vietnam veterans still there, but it had a very, very strong Māori environment and wairua. And I was taken under the wings of many mentors who instilled in me a desire to do as well as I could do. Māori had not been at that stage promoted as rigorously through the ranks, and particularly into the officer corps, and so I acknowledge people like General Jerry Mataparai for his success, but there were others like Matt the Poe that basically guided many of us younger Māori coming through the ranks, and instilled in us a desire to do our very best. So I sort of take the view that success is really about doing your very, very best and knowing that you've given it everything you have, and never making excuses. And so
that came from the army. That came from the military. But you are someone who you're a voracious reader. You are a quick study. You have a passion for learning. Did that all come from the army, or is there a certain innate sense of that, a natural part of that is just you, and that comes from somewhere?
I think that could be part of my innate makeup, as you're suggesting, Julian. I think the military and the mentors that I was fortunate to be subjected to really just unlocked that ability through their own leadership as well. So I was a kid that grew up in households where it was a state house upbringing. Our parents basically lived from wage packet to wage packet. There was no job security. There was a very vibrant manufacturing factory type sector at that time, but everything was very short term, and I think that was probably another factor that was instilled in me from my upbringing, is that not to lead that transient, exposed sort of lifestyle as well, and so something just clicked along the way that education was the key to unlocking a different pathway.
Right, but the military was one that kind of honed that for you, that helped
absolutely
craft that kind of path, I guess, for you to kind of follow.
Yeah, absolutely, Julian. I've seen so many people come out of the military that have gone on to do some really amazing things, and I think, like me, they appreciated the discipline, the sense of focus that you can get, but also exposure to a different type of leadership that you don't see in regular society or civilian lifestyle, lives, and so just being really, really fortunate.
Not many of them come out though in wanting to be accountants, Jim.
True, and
because I apologise for almost seeming fairly kind of lackadaisical about the way that we're approaching this, but I'm trying to get to the point where you come out of the military, you become an accountant, and let's face it, accountants aren't the most natural leaders in the world.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. It probably seems quite contrary to everything I've been saying, you know, in terms of about, you know, leadership and people and those sorts of skills. But yeah, it was just a pragmatic decision, Julian, because I recognised that the key decision makers in business or in government or in the not-for-profit sector, typically whenever those decisions were being made, there was somebody with a financial background in that room or at that table making that decision. So I just pragmatically thought it was a way to go through the ranks in the commercial sector, and I had no real affinity for accounting. I was probably a very average accountant, but I, you know,
I don't know about that. Basics. I remember a lot of proposals trying to get a story for Native Affairs that got turned down by the astute accounting of Jim Mather.
Well, it may have been the quality of the proposals. I'm not quite sure, but anyhow, yeah. So it's a good skill set to have because I think you know, the reality is every entity, every initiative, every movement needs to be financially sustainable, and so having a financial background gives you, you know, those insights that are necessary.
You said that the army was life-changing, which infers that there are a lot of things that happened in your youth and potentially as a child, which, but for, you know, that oft-quoted phrase, for the grace of God go I kind of thing, right? Yeah. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, to give you an example, Julian, I remember on my very first night in Her Majesty's service, you know, turning up to Wairau at 18 years of age. We just got off the train at the station. We got picked up in an old Bedford RT truck and transferred to the barracks. And I looked around the room. Everybody was a similar age to me. There were quite a number of Maori and one Fijian. And it was you know, it was snowing outside, it was cold, and we had to stand there literally for about 2 hours before anybody even acknowledged, you know, our presence, let alone arrival. And when I say standing, they were standing to attention, which was an unusual thing for a kid from Māori to be doing. And I can remember that very first night lying in the bed thinking, wow, this is an amazing place. I'm in a warm bed, I've got a roof over my head, I've been told I'm going to get 3 meals a day, and I'm going to be paid reasonably well, you know, back at that time, to become fit and be paid to go camping. And I thought this is an amazing journey I was on, and on both sides of the bed I was in, I could hear 2 young men sobbing and trying to write letters home to their mums with torches under the blankets. And it made me really realise that I had no real strong connection back to my whānau, my immediate whānau like that. I probably had been brought up in a way that I was a lot more independent at a younger age and didn't feel those, you know, paternal ties that these others were. So I think, you know, the upbringing probably prepared me well for the military lifestyle.
Why was that? Why did you not feel the paternal connections that you talked about?
Yeah, probably because the whānau I grew up in was one whereby our parents weren't warm or effusive in their aroha, and so we grew up quite independent. My parents actually separated when I was quite young, so we had been whānaui'd out to a range of other whānau members, and so that was how I ended up with my koroa nanny and te tiko, and so myself and my siblings would sort of see each other at whānau hui or at the marae or at a tangi, and then go back to the whānau members that we were living with at that time. So I suppose that explains in part, you know, that I suppose hardness is one way of, you know, emotional hardness, you know, and I did reflect on that, and why wasn't I, you know, upset like my 2 new comrades were, and it's because, you know, there was an emotional hardness, and I think that probably was part of why I felt driven to be successful as well, because you know, I had come through a fairly tired sort of upbringing, and didn't want that repeated in my life.
Because there are many reasons that we found anyway why people are successful, right? Some of it's through the divine, some of it's through the guidance of others, some of it is because people were chosen by elders to fulfill a role.
Yes.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is yours is driven by pure independence, that yours is driven by your own sense of purpose, of want, of aspiration that came from within you, that you did it yourself.
Yes.
With the help of others, obviously, but that's what drove you from a very young age, even to now, to a certain degree.
Yeah, absolutely, Julian. And I think, you know, I've always had this mantra. It's a really simple one, which was, if it is to be, it's up to me. And so it's sort of, you develop a sense of self-reliance and independence, and really all, you know, we're all shaped by our upbringing. And, you know, there's that long raging debate whether it's, you know, nurture or nature. And I think, you know, nature has a role, but I think, you know, your nurturing environment, you know, does impact on the person that you do become. And so I think, yeah, no, I would say that for me personally, it was a background that made me feel more stronger and more emotionally well equipped to face challenges. But unfortunately for the vast majority, it can actually probably be a beginning of a downward spiral. And so it's part of the reason why I'm sort of focused now on giving back to the communities that have nurtured me through some of the foundations and charitable trusts that I'm part of as well.
Well, we will talk about that, but it seems like a very kind of isolationist kind of approach.
Yeah.
A very independent kind of position to take, right? That, as you say, if it is to be, it's up to me. And I wonder, in that kind of time in your life when it is so independent, not self-centered, but certainly about self and guiding oneself through things, whether you ever felt at that time that there potentially is another way, or simply it worked for you at that time and you just kept following it through. That's the style of leadership, that's the style of guidance that you had, that's what you kind of had laid for yourself to go forward with, and whether or not you'd ever considered at some point there might be a different way of doing this.
Yeah, as you get older, you know, you reflect on who you are, your identity, and the way you've led your life, and I think you do mellow over time, and I think, you know, the hallmark of Māori men is that we get better as we get older, and we get more in touch with you know, who we are, and I think more expressive and more prepared to expose, you know, who we are through our emotions and the like, Julian, and yeah, but you can't go past, you know, those formative years that really do shape who you are.
It's an interesting point you've just made, because you identified in your thesis, and I think you challenged, I guess we could call it contemporary orthodoxy around Māori leadership, particularly in iwi organisations. You challenged the status quo. I think we can call it the status quo, because a lot of the tribal organisational leaders at that time are male, they're older, and I'm paraphrasing, but your challenge to them is it's time to move on. And actually what I think you also potentially mentioned in the thesis is that actually they become more isolationist as they get older. It's about control and authority and power and the loss of your kind of connection to constituency, and you mentioned this a lot in the thesis. And you talked about your style of leadership kind of changing, and yourself, your personality changes at that time. But in the thesis, that's not what you say. In actual fact, what you think, what you see is iwi leadership becoming more and more self-preservationist at the expense of the advancement and development of iwi. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, wrote the thesis, which, if I can remember correctly, was a thesis on Māori Economic Development from a Ngāti Awa perspective, but it was really my contribution back to my iwi. And the interesting thing was the very first person I spoke to about the thesis was Tāhereni Mokomi. And I met him in the Koru Lounge at Auckland Airport. He was just finishing his dessert, and I was just waiting for the appropriate moment to talk to him about being my kaumātua, my kaitiaki, my mentor, and as well as a secondary supervisor. And the reason being is that that I thought that it was important to get our tino rangatira aligned. Well, I thought aligned with what I was trying to do and see what his views were. He, in his very astute way, just listened to what I had to say whilst he was finishing his dessert, and basically just said that he would support that endeavour, because he thought that it was important for us to challenge ourselves around our leadership succession approaches. And one could be very facetious and say that what had occurred as a general rule within Te Ao Māori is that the 80-year-olds would call a meeting of the 70-year-olds to decide which of the 60-year-olds are going to sack. And that was basically something that had been conveyed to me. And then you had this whole pipeline of very talented, very smart, well-educated, culturally tuned young people coming through the various pathways to leadership. And so my contribution back to my iwi was to look at our treaty settlement, which was quite a humble treaty settlement of approximately $43 million back in 2004, and challenge the iwi as to not only how it was being protected and grown, but more importantly, how the people were of the iwi were benefiting from it. And so that requires a maturity to actually say, you know, there are different stages that we go through as iwi, particularly those going through the settlement process and the establishment of Wānanga and the development of commercial arms and so forth. And it was really, are we getting the balance right between the commercial focus, the cultural focus, and the community focus? And so to that end, I interviewed a range of people within the iwi, within the Wānanga and outside the Wānanga, and basically reflected back, you know, what was being said, which was that change was required, and you know, a measured transitional change was required, but we had gone through the settlement phase, and we were now on the post-settlement governance entity stage.
And Ngāti Awa was fairly successful, right? I mean, it started off at 42 million, I think it was. At that stage when you did the thesis, it was up to about 110 million, so within 10 years. Yeah, so pretty good growth, and obviously there are some impacts now as a result of certain events around holdings portfolios and the likes. But they were fairly successful at the time. So how are people taking the challenges that you were making directly to them? Yeah,
well, you never want to be a tino whakaputa mōhio, Julian, particularly when you don't live in your rohe. I think whakapapa is important, and if we can all relate back to our whakapapa, it gives us the right to make observations. So it was, I had to tread carefully in terms of once the thesis had been completed and published, and there was a whole series of recommendations, and I talked to and had been talking to a number of people in the Wānanga and outside of it. I was invited by Tāhereni Mokomi to present my thesis to the iwi, to the Wānanga. And so I can recall, this is about 2015, driving to Whakatane, knowing that there was a runanga hui underway, and knowing that a number of people disagreed with the conclusions that have been drawn, and I was expecting some challenge and pushback, and probably I was hoping would stop short of violent objections towards me. But anyhow, I got there. The meeting was underway. I sat against a wall in the corner, waiting for my call up, and then thinking, this could end up badly for me. But at least I've stayed true, to the co-op of this thesis, which was basically challenging the iwi on the pathway forward, and whether in fact we were taking the people with us, and whether we had the right leadership in place. And so Tāhirini, after morning tea, made a very, very brief introduction. He made no mention that he was my mentor, my kaitiaki kaumātua, and just gave me the floor. Yeah. And so after my mihi response and an acknowledgement of all of the assembled rangatira of our iwi, I just basically said, you've all read the conclusions, and we have got a lot of work to do. We know we can do much better. We have to do better for our people, because that's what you've all told me. Mm. And so that was it, the presentation. And Hirini obviously wanted to create more debate, and I think he said something along the lines of, so in one sentence, how would you describe our performance? And I thought that I was quite emboldened, because there had been no animosity or objections to this point. I said, well, to be frank, I think we, like many other iwi, lurched from one crisis to another. That went down like the proverbial lead balloon, and I was given short shrift soon after, and anyway, Hirini said, well, I think that requires no explanation, which was good, because I didn't think it was appropriate to identify the negatives, because there was a lot of positives about what we're doing, and I didn't want it to be a deficit-based sort of kōrero. And anyway, so Hirini said, well, what is the solution to the problems we have? And the only word that popped straight into my mind was kotahitanga, a unified sense of purpose, and having agreed pathway forward. But kotahitanga was the solution. There was muted applause, and basically I was ejected from the room afterwards, after there was a presentation ceremony where I handed over my bound hard copy of the thesis to Hirini and Matua Hohepa Mason, and I don't think that thesis has ever seen the light of day since, but they must have taken some things on board, because I got invited back to be a director of the commercial arm, so I've been there for 2 years now. And I think the message was, don't tell us what you think the problems are, come and be part of the solution. So I think that was important.
I think the reason why this is important to have this conversation, because as you know, similar structure to Ngāti Awa Holdings Company, directors, most of the directors are hika, and you talk about this in the thesis, right? Most of them are based at home. It's good learning for me also as a ngāpuhi, we're on a journey. I won't describe what many people the words people would use for that journey, but on a journey, right? So there are a couple of things that I wanted to explore, some ideas with you, and then we'll go to some other things. The ideas I wanted to explore with you were about the traditional kind of concept of only ahika-based representatives on iwi boards, and what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think you need a mix of skills to get the best results, and I think having ahika representatives is important, so that the voice of the people is heard at the table when decisions are made.
But only ahika?
No, I think that there also needs to be independent directors as well that bring skills that the ahika don't have. Okay. And I think that's critical, because at the end of the day, it's about results and performance, and you've got to have the right team in place to achieve that. And Well, I think you know the haukainga need to recognise that if all the skills aren't present, you know, within the ahika, then we've got to go outside and pull those people in.
Term limits. Waikato Tainui employs a concept of term limits for those on the executive of Te Aratauta. I'm not sure if many other iwi do. Should there be term limits for those who go onto iwi governance boards?
Oh, absolutely. I think you know, 3 years seems like a reasonable term. You've got to perform and deliver results. You know, see at many iwi there was almost lifetime, you know, appointments, and I think they're wrong because what that's doing is it's holding up that burgeoning pipeline of talent coming from behind. So
a 3-term, 3-year per term limit, do you think is?
Yeah, well I think everything, there should be no sense of entitlement beyond a 3-year period. You've got to be able to, you know, reflect and refer back to your contribution and success. And if it's a barren kete, then you've got to be prepared to move on. But I think some of our iwi entities need to take a you know, far more rigorous approach around that.
Forced diversity, 50-50, so 50% male, 50% female?
I don't think it should be forced diversity. I think there should be, as a matter of course, that's the ideal scenario. But I have no problem if I'm the only male on a board, and if my fellow wahine colleagues, you know, as skilled or even, you know, far more skilled than I, all the better. But I think there does need to be gender diversity on board. Otherwise, all you're hearing is typically, you know, a similar perspective from men who have very similar backgrounds.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and then we'll move on to other things. The other thing I wanted to talk about was you support the notion of having a holdings company as a separate, almost a separate entity, right? As a part of an iwi structure or an iwi organisational structure, so long as, and I think the quote is, that the tail isn't wagging the dog, which does happen on occasion. So how do you balance that off? How do you make sure that's right? Because it has happened in iwi governance, iwi organisations.
Yes. Yeah, I think, well, I think Ngāi Tahu has probably demonstrated a model which ensures that the tail is not wagging the dog. And it goes back to, you know, the purpose of the commercial entities, and putting it in really blunt terms, it's just to maximise the commercial return on the assets of the iwi and for the people. But the real important leadership roles undertaken by the Wānanga and all the commercial arms is just engine rooms for investment, growth, development and returns. And so how do you safeguard against the tail wagging? Just make sure your constitution's established in a way that that the board is accountable, of the commercial arm is accountable to the iwi entity, that there are letters of expectation in place. Plus also you have some people on the Wānanga that have some commercial nous as well that can maintain compliance.
Right. So given all this knowledge that you've accumulated and presented, I think, very well in the thesis, and it won't surprise you that I had a review of the thesis itself, and your connection now, and obviously you're a director of Ngāti Awa, you're also the chair of some charitable organisations, and of course you're a former chief executive of Te Wānanga Aotearoa, the Pacific Business Trust, and of course Māori Television. So given all that knowledge and experience and expertise, why then are you now the chair of one of the bastions of Pākehā that is Radio New Zealand?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I expect the reason why I was appointed, Julian, is because Radio New Zealand, with its 95 years of history and heritage, doesn't, with respect, reflect all of Aotearoa New Zealand. And I say that on the basis that the audience has predominantly been older Pākehā that have supported the ethos of strong journalism, current affairs news and so forth. And I believe that the incoming Labour government at the time I was appointed recognised that if you truly wanted diversity and Māori perspectives in a public service media organisation like Te Reo Irirangi o Aotearoa Radio New Zealand, you needed Māori leadership, you needed Māori influence at the board level and at the management level as well. So I think my appointment reflected the desire of the government to ensure that Radio New Zealand reflected the state of our country, but also the future as well. And we see it happening in health, we see it happening in education, and I think it's one of the most uplifting things that is coming through for Aotearoa New Zealand in 2020 is the level of Māori leadership coming to the fore, not just in Māori entities, but more importantly in what we term mainstream, organisations as well.
And of course, you're also the chair of the DHB in the Waiariki region. But what would your report card? What's your self-assessment of how successful you've been in achieving your aspiration of? I'll use the word diversity, but it's probably different from that. Particularly reflecting Māori voices, Māori thoughts, Māori perspectives at Radio New Zealand in your term thus far, coming up to about 3 years now. Yeah,
it's a work in progress, Julian, and I think it's important that.
Is that a diplomatic answer?
Yeah, it probably is, but the blunt answer is we need to do more. It's been about intent. We need to move it from intent to action. And coincidentally, the drive that I have, and what may be my final, year of my tenure, is to really embed the focus for RNZ to be an exemplary treaty partner, to recognise that whenever you've got that name New Zealand in your title, you really need to reflect all of Aotearoa New Zealand. And so we're having some really difficult discussions at the board and management level at RNZ at this time around have we been an effective treaty partner? Are there equitable services, perspectives, programming, voices that Māori can relate to? The answer is no to both questions. And so the next phase we're at now is, well, what do we need to do? And I'm a believer in that concept of those who know why will always beat those who know how. And so why is a treaty important to an organisation like RNZ? And the answer is because if we want to be truly Radio New Zealand, or Te Reo Irirangi o Aotearoa, we need to be better New Zealanders. We need to make it a better New Zealand service, and you can't do that if you're only serving one part of the population, and Māori and Pasifika and our ethnic communities aren't part of that same level of support and delivery. So yeah, for us, we're moving very quickly now, Julian, and you are going to see, and we're seeing it already, more Māori, kaupapa Māori programs coming through, stories of Rua Peka Peka, Waitara, as some examples. We're seeing more Māori themed podcasts, but what we need is a superb Māori broadcaster on one of our high profile programs saying to Aotearoa New Zealand, this is for us as well.
Yeah, and it won't surprise you that periodically I will posit challenges to you. Why then do we still have Concert FM?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because there was some controversy, as you recall.
I heard about it.
Julian, and whereby we at RNZ looked at our charter and said we're not delivering effectively on our charter. There's a section in our charter which says that RNZ must provide services to Māori, Pasifika peoples, and young New Zealanders. And those are three audiences that we primarily don't serve well. We have a Pacific service, which ironically is very well serviced by RNZ, but our domestic Pacific communities don't get that same level of service. So our view was that how could we reach an audience that we hadn't previously been connected with, and it was by creating a new service for young people, for Māori, Pasifika, and other young New Zealanders, and music-based. But it wasn't just a music station for youth. It was about creating a forum for young Māori and Pasifika predominantly to engage with RNZ, to have a platform to share their whakaaro, their views. Podcasts would be developed primarily focused on that audience. Music would be, we would have people that were influencers in that sector, such as Stan Walker and others that would be part of the oversight and management, and so it was actually making RNZ more relevant for more New Zealanders. The problem we had was that we wanted to deliver the service on our FM frequency, and that housed something called RNZ Concert, which had been around for 80 years, and so it was a decision based on the future of RNZ, and also are there other alternatives for our loyal RNZ concert audiences, and the thinking was you've got Freeview, we have other options, and the AM channel frequency was put up as another option as well. But to cut a long story short, this was about a movement away from a traditional audience to attracting a new audience, primarily a young brown audience. The traditional audience didn't respond well to that strategy, but for me it's about challenging the status quo, and this we were going to retain the RNZ concert service, but it was also a signal that you've got to be aware that there's embedded history, and to be blunt, also a sense of entitlement and privilege that exists within sectors of our society. And so all of a sudden we found ourselves with what was a very well thought through plan aligned with our charter, and a huge backlash from an audience that didn't want to share a resource or were prepared to see any redistribution of assets.
And you're probably aware that backlash was going to occur. It reminded me a little bit of what happened with Rugby World Cup commentary with Māori television, where, and this is a really good thing to talk about in terms of how society has changed or potentially hasn't changed, because I suspect a lot of those people who were complaining actually weren't RNZ concert audience members at all, though they were saying they were. The audience ratings would suggest otherwise. But anyway, we are where we are, right? But it reminded me of that time at the Rugby World Cup where there was, as you say, a section of New Zealand society who are resistant to change, particularly when it comes to recognition of the place of tangata whenua, of Pasifika, in the social fabric of our country. And I wonder if you felt at the same time this kind of sense of, I've been here before.
Well, there are definite parallels, Julian, and to be quite blunt, there were, some people that saw this as nothing more than entrenched Pākehā privilege coming to the fore. To be a little more generous, probably there are those that are in that RNZ concert fraternity that see it as a taonga similar to the kapahaka fraternity within Māoridom, and it was sort of something that was really dear to their heart. So respected that, But I suppose where it became concerning for me was when I had predominantly Pākehā New Zealanders telling me that this was cultural vandalism, and there was no real reference points for, apart from the fact that something that many of them saw as being a crucial part of their cultural outlook on life was now being challenged. And so, welcome to our world. This is what Māori see all the time. This is what Pasifika, see all the time. So it was an important debate, I think, that needed to be had. But I think the debate didn't run its course because of the overwhelming influence and support that a highly privileged sector of our society had, and that came to the fore. But for me, the important thing is we've now got the opportunity to do both, and where there's a will, there's a way.
But this challenge of the status quo that you have experienced and, to be honest, developed throughout your career, similar to the Rugby World Cup broadcasting rights, with a similar section of New Zealand society being totally driven against something that you were leading in conjunction with others, yes, but you were essentially leading with the leadership, of course, of Wayne Walden, who was the chair of Māori Television at the time, where people are saying, and Michael Laws, I remember the quote, I would trust Māori Television's ability to broadcast the Rugby World Cup as I would a small child with a knife. So how do you, who is pushing and constant, and not constantly, but you challenge society to change the status quo for the benefit of Māori rights and interests, for the benefit of Māori perspective. What goes on in your mind when these societal challenges are being made indirectly at you, but really directly at what you're trying to do? And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's got to be about equity and fairness, Julian,
but there are political realities that exist, and that's what happened with the Rugby World Cup, and a little bit of that happened with RSC Concert as well, that you have to deal with, which surely is frustrating.
Well, it's frustrating is one way of putting it. I suppose it's sort of quite uplifting in another way, that you're actually saying, no, we're going to make a stand on this. This is important, and not just to Māori, but it's also important for the country to mature and develop, and to recognise, going back to the treaty, our partnership-based approach, and so partnership requires fairness and equity. It requires a willingness to actually be challenged, and so I think I've always thought that it was important to be prepared to challenge the status quo with the view that it was going to make us a much more mature, focused country, and I say that in a way that is not self-indulgent, Julian. I just think that if you're Māori and you've got a level of influence and you have an opportunity to correct something that's wrong, it's always the right time to do the right thing, is my view.
Yeah, but how do you deal though with? I mean, these are good cases that you put up for change, right? They stack up economically, culturally, socially, or everything else, and yet. And I don't want to go too much into the Rugby World Cup issue, and I don't want to really go too much into the RSC Concert issue, but where you're doing the right thing, it's the right thing to do, and all of a sudden things change. And yes, you've got a good outcome with RSC Concert, and yes, we've got a good outcome with the Rugby World Cup rights as well, with the broadcast and the amazing audience that Māori Television was able to achieve over the time where you were leading that organisation. But I guess what I'm trying to do is think about how do you in your own mind go, okay, I didn't get to where I eventually got to, but we're going to get to a point. But how do you keep forging your way through it? How do you keep, okay, now I'm going to do this, and I'm going to challenge again, and I'm going to make another challenge, make another change, even though you know that this is potentially going to end up in the same situation where the outcome might not accrue the way that you wanted it to.
Yeah, it's it's about progress, and and being prepared to put these confronting issues to the fore. Like in the health sector, for example, we're having this debate about Māori equity and post-coronavirus, prioritising Māori and Pasifika and the waiting lists for a whole range of reasons. So that's a different sector altogether. But I think the more confronting the issues, the more the realisation from our fellow New Zealanders that historically we've had this inequitable situation. We actually need to recognise what the future of the country looks like and be prepared to ask ourselves, are we actually doing the right thing? So I don't feel demoralised or frustrated. I just think, that started that debate, and whilst people may have strong views, for example, the RNZ concert issue, everybody will reflect on what their positions are and how they conduct themselves through the debate, and I think it's always important, that point, Julian, that we're respectful, we understand the views of the others, but we don't compromise on what our position is. So I suppose I'm just driven by trying to initiate change and follow through as robustly as I possibly can do. It's going to upset a lot of people, and that's not a bad thing either as well, because at least it's going to create that sense of a contest of ideas and whether we are on the right pathway. But look, 2040, 20 years away from the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, we've got to ask ourselves, are we going to be that nation that's predicated on fairness and equity, and that's prepared to address all of the problems that we've encountered historically. I think we're making good progress, but it's important that we continue to debate and challenge these issues.
Do you say making good progress also in health? I mean, media is easier because it's, I don't want to bag my own profession, but it's a bit of makeup, a bit of camera, and
you know what I mean. More than that, Julian.
No, but health you're dealing with. I mean, these are livelihood issues. These are life issues, right? That you have to deal with. Yeah. So. And we always hear about the negative statistics and things, yes, have changed, but there's a lot more work to do. And as you say, I think you're giving yourself a 20-year target, right? Yeah. How far can we go in the next 20 years? I mean, you're the one in one of the pivotal positions, given your role as the chair of the DHB. So realistically, Jim, how far can we go in the next 20 years to be able to achieve that aspiration that you have, given you are, as I say, dealing with people and their life?
Yeah, I'm confident we can get to where we need to be, Julian. I'm new to the health sector. I've only been chairing a regional DHB, the Wairiki Lakes DHB, since the end of last year, but I'm impressed with the health sector because they are prepared to actually go that extra mile and beyond to get equitable health outcomes for Māori, and right from the very top, Minister of Health, the Director General of Health, Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, everything is about a focus on Māori equity, and probably relates to why I and 3 other Māori were appointed chairs of 4 of the 20 DHBs, which up until that point there hadn't been a Māori chair of any DHB. So I think there's been a statement made that if you want change, you've got to bring in the right leadership to effect that change. And we're having some long overdue debates about equity. See, the thing about equity is that you want everybody to have the same view of the playground, so you've got to give them different sized boxes because you may have taller people and shorter people, and Māori you know, need bigger boxes to get a fair view of that playground.
And Pacifica an even bigger
Yeah,
box,
and Pacifica even bigger. And so that means that you've got to put more resource there, more focus, more investment. And as soon as you start doing that, you know, the majority start saying there's an inequitable focus on the minority and all the rest of it. But
it takes longer to achieve the outcomes too.
Exactly, yeah. But that's just what we've got to do. But I think the health sector is probably, and I mean this with all due respect to my colleagues in the media sector, more grounded, because if they get it wrong, people die. If they get it wrong, sick people don't get better. And so there's that grounded requirement to make the right decisions. And so you know, we've got our own Māori Equity committee at Lakes DHB, and other DHBs are doing similar things, whereby what you're trying to do is effect the change at the top, at the board level, management level, and then it throws through the organisation. It's got to come from within the ranks as well. I acknowledge people like Pat Sneddon that are always pushing the Māori health equity issues to the fore, and people that are really prepared to, you know, make bold statements like, we are going to prioritise Māori and Pacifica because they are high risk, and clinically those that are at the highest risk get medical attention first, and so it aligns well with the view of the clinicians as well within the hospitals, that those at higher risk then get served first, and Māori and Pacifica, not unsurprisingly, are always in that high risk category.
You've been an academic in leadership. You have been executive management, now in governance. Think back to something you got wrong.
Yeah.
And what you've learned from it. And if you can, give me the example of where you got it wrong.
Yeah.
Few and far between as they would have been, Jim.
I'm just trying to rank all of the things I got wrong, you know, in terms of relevance, Julian, and many things over the years, but I think the key thing is when you get something wrong is just acknowledging, you know, you got it wrong, and being prepared to go back and fix it, and make it better. But of the many things that I've got wrong, probably something would be going back to that Rugby World Cup issue that you mentioned, Julian, was being prepared to compromise on that. I think even though we had an outstanding tournament and we delivered a brilliant Rugby World Cup coverage, had my time over again, I probably would have not compromised on that, and actually would have been prepared to take a legal challenge to protect our rights as the exclusive Rugby World Cup broadcaster, which is what had been agreed to with the Rugby World Cup.
How did it turn?
Basically, political pressure
from who?
From the government of the day, the overwhelming view of the board of the time that we needed to step back from our position. I know Tā Peter Sharples, was the Minister of Māori Affairs at that time, and he thought we had received a significant win, and so I think everybody was prepared to step back at that point. But I've often thought, why didn't we just push ahead and make a real statement about the rights of a kaupapa Māori organisation, and actually I think we would have won a legal case. I've no doubt about it, because we had done everything appropriately. We conducted ourselves in the absolute highest to the highest standards. the Rugby World Cup organising committee were very, very supportive. They had, for example, asked for individual bids, and so you had the two commercial broadcasters basically combining their bid, thinking that there was no other player in the mix, and then we came out of left field. And so that engendered a strong level of support from the organising committee of the Rugby World Cup. So yeah, we got a lot of benefit from that, but I often wonder whether we as Māori are prepared to compromise to be a good treaty partner as well.
When it doesn't happen on the other side.
Yeah, that's often the case. So I was having lunch with a person that highly influential in the previous Business Roundtable forum, runs an organisation now which promotes quite right-wing ideological viewpoints, and he said to me, why do we need a treaty? Why can't we just base everything on fairness and equity? And I said, well, that would be great, but it doesn't work that way, because we have traditionally, historically, always been treated inequitably and unfairly, and unless we actually had a treaty or a reference point to actually emphasise our right to these things, they wouldn't happen. So that's why we as Māori hold the Treaty of Waitangi so close to our hearts.
Yeah, it's almost become like a North Star now, right? It's like that's got to be the guiding point, right? And we're going to go that way. Funny, because I was going to ask you about what you think your greatest success was, and I thought it might have been Rugby World Cup, given the millions of people who watch, but and the work of Tarahi Maipi, who wasn't bad, better than others. So, and this sounds very flippant, I know, and I apologise for it. But what do you rank as your greatest success?
Māori television. I think
even now.
Yeah, even now, I think Māori television was, we're part of it, Julian, and I think I often think about my koro and who I grew up with when I was young, and he once said to me when I went to visit him when I was in the military on leave, and as I was leaving, he rushed out of the house to bid me farewell and said, boy, I have to share with you, this was 1982, that he had been watching a new program called Te Karere, and he could not believe that every day, weekdays, Māori would receive their news in te reo Māori with a tirohanga Māori for 5 minutes. He just thought that was the most astounding thing that had happened in his lifetime. So when I often think about Māori television, I used to reflect on what would my koro and Nani think about, what we achieved. Te Arihi, Jade Maipi, the whole whānau of Māori television, whakaata Māori, and it was sort of like, if he was so impressed that that we were allowed 5 minutes of airtime in 1982, what would he have thought about Māori television in the early 2000s and beyond, and the fact that it was basically completely kaupapa Māori. It had a large majority of broadcast in te reo Māori. So Māori television, I think, has been the biggest success that I've been part of. I wouldn't say it's my biggest success, it was our success, Julian. And nothing's ever come close to that, because of the fact that people like Hurangi Waikiripuru and others had fought for the right to have a Māori television service. He had to, mortgage his personal home along with others, other members of Kaiwhakapūmau, and he put his personal livelihood at risk. I you know, recall him telling me about how he went over to London to support the claim that was being made with the Privy Council, and how he'd go to a phone box every night and phone back his colleagues and explain to them the progress that was being made. So there was a great sense of responsibility to get it right, because of the work that Huarangi and others had done, and there were many others. And you know, the sense of national identity, the sense of pride for Māori that came from the advent of whakaata Māori, I think is probably not going to be you know, equalled.
I remember when we went to Taiwan. Do you remember? And we had that hui on the last night. It was essentially a party, but there was no drinking going on.
Yeah.
And they had that dancing, and then they put him on. Do you remember where they put him on that chair? The
Yes,
Taiwanese put him on, and they threw him up in the air, and he was all of 80 something or other. And I remember thinking, man, I just remember thinking, this is awesome that people who don't know Huirangi, but can kind of feel something about him and treat him like he was for us the kind of I guess the foundation of Māori broadcasting. They knew that, you know, they could feel that with him, and were treating him in that way. And I just thought, yeah, wow, what an awesome way for him to be kind of acknowledged by people. Different country, different culture, different language.
Yeah, well, you and I were there on that particular trip where we took Huarangi, who was our chair of our Kaunihera Kaumātua, to our World Indigenous Television Broadcasters conference in Taiwan, and I still remember the time where we walked through the Indigenous townships, and Huarangi would acknowledge his contemporaries, the Taiwanese kaumātua, and even though they were speaking different languages, they understood implicitly what each other, you know, were saying and gesturing to each other.
No briefing.
It was
all straight in. Yeah.
Absolutely, and so the tikanga just was natural for us as Māori and for them as Indigenous Taiwanese that was merged. And I remember this will show you the pragmatism of the statement of Huarangi, was that he often referred to Taiwan as the birthplace of Māori before they started their great, before we started our great trans-Pacific migration, and so he'd referred to it several times, and actually, you know, had made note of a particular area that he said waka were launched from. And I said to Huarangi, in a period of respite, you know, how did he actually know that a waka had been launched from that bay down there that went through the various Pacific islands right through to the west coast of South America, at Rapa Nui and Tahiti and Hawaii and so forth? And he just said, well, it just looks like a good place to launch a waka to me, Jim. But it carried so much gravitas because it was Huarangi Waikiri.
I remember that. I don't mean to be self-indulgent. I also remember you and him being very practical, because when we had the pōhiri and I went out there with my maro and my taiaha, and there was a certain point in that pōhiri where they brought out those bamboo sticks.
That's right.
And then out of nowhere, these two men bearing machetes jumped out of nowhere, and I thought, it's all right, the kaumātua and my boss have my back. 100 metres away. 100 metres away, you were saying, don't bring a knife to a gun.
Yeah, that's right. I think you had your taiaha that looked impressive when you first walked out, but pale by comparison when they turned up with their machete. But just going back to your question, Julian, you know, as we know, Māori television, you know, will hold a special place in our lives. So I think for everyone that served there, you know, during that formative period when it was being established and developed, I think the impact it had for the wairu of Te Iwi Māori was really important as well. And no, not to denigrate the efforts or the progress that has been made in later stages, but we were lucky that we caught that the crest of that wave where television was still at its paramount peak, you know, and so a great time for us all.
I think we'll leave it there. It's a good way to end this session. Nō reira, tākuta, James Daniel Mather. Tēnā koe, Ngāti Awa te toki, ke kahatunu koe roto i o mahi katoa, mō tātou katoa. Nō reira, e te hoa Jim, tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe te ho Pumo, Julian. A kānui taku hariko i tēnei wā ki te kōrero ki a koe. Ahakoa he kōrero tino roa. Tēnei ko taku whakaro he mihi tēnei ki a koe mo tō tautoko mai ki au ki te whakatakoto ōku whakaro mo enei kaupapa katoa hoena e te hoa tēnā koe. Ngā mihi.